Let's jump right into this explainer on the fascinating and honestly pretty controversial biography of John Perkins. We're going to unpack the intense journey he lays out in his explosive book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Now, this isn't just a dry breakdown of global economics. It is the deeply personal story of a man who claims he literally helped build a global corporate empire only to turn around, years later, and blow the whistle on the very system he created. We'll be walking through his life's narrative, taking him from a rural New England upbringing straight to the hidden, highest levels of international finance.
So, based on his own biography, we really have to start by asking the exact same question Perkins asks himself: how in the world does a middle-class kid, born in 1945 to strict, puritanical parents in rural New Hampshire, end up at the absolute beating heart of global corporatocracy? He describes himself as an only child, heavily influenced by the American dream, but, at the same time, deeply conflicted about his country's role in the wider world.
Well, to understand his descent into that world, we have to look at his pretty innocent beginnings. Back in 1968, Perkins graduated from business school. The Vietnam War was raging, and even though he was a bit of a war history buff, he was absolutely determined not to get involved in that specific conflict. So, to avoid the draft, he and his new wife Anne actually joined the Peace Corps. They were sent way down to the Ecuadorian Amazon. By 1968, he's living out in the rainforest, totally immersed in local cultures, and seeing firsthand the struggles of indigenous communities dealing with major oil companies. But, his time out there in Ecuador quickly caught the attention of some seriously powerful people. Turns out, his wife had a family friend they called Uncle Frank, who happened to be a top executive at the National Security Agency, and the NSA had been profiling Perkins. While he was still in Ecuador, he was introduced to an executive from an international consulting firm called Maine, who also just happened to be an NSA liaison. Because Perkins was young, hungry, and willing to write economic forecasts out in those rugged conditions, Maine officially hired him as an economist back in Boston in January 1971.
Section 1. Training an Economic Hitman.
Now, Perkins claims he wasn't brought on just to be a standard number cruncher. Not at all. He describes this highly clandestine training process led by a woman named Claudine in the Boston office. She chillingly initiated him into what she called a rare breed of professionals. She told him, totally point blank, that they were in a dirty business, essentially cheating developing countries out of billions of dollars. And before he officially accepted the job, she gave him this stark warning. Once you're in for life. He was explicitly told that he couldn't even tell his own wife what he actually did for a living.
Claudine taught him a very specific three-step playbook for this. Step 1. Perkins had to produce highly optimistic, basically inflated economic forecasts to justify massive international loans for infrastructure projects in developing nations. Step 2. That loan money? It wouldn't actually go to the country itself. It'd get funneled directly into the pockets of massive U.S. engineering and construction firms that were building the power plants and airports. And step 3, the borrowing country would be left trapped in a massive, inescapable web of debt.
And he lays out that the ultimate goal of plunging these developing nations into debt was never about ending their poverty. Actually, it was a highly calculated geopolitical strategy. Once a country inevitably couldn't pay its debt, the U.S. could demand total political and economic subservience. This meant extracting strategic military bases, securing incredibly cheap access to natural resources like oil, and basically just forcing those nations to fall in line with U.S. commercial interests on the global stage.
Section 2. The Web of Debt. Building a Corporate Empire.
Armed with this strategy and fully trained to deceive, Perkins just completely embraced his role. His rise within the company was rapid. By 1975, he became the youngest partner in Maine's 100-year history. Fast forward to 1977, and he's built a mini empire of his own. He was named Manager of Economics and Regional Planning, managing an entire international staff, and even lecturing at Harvard. He was jet-setting across the globe, convincing leaders all over Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East to swallow these predatory loans. To really grasp how valuable he was to this inner circle, check out this one incredibly deceptive line he kept on his resume: advisor to the U.S. Department of the Treasury and Saudi Arabia. Now, to an outsider, that just looks like high-level consulting. But to insiders, it signaled that he was part of a covert team crafting a monumental deal to secretly tie U.S. currency and corporate interest directly to Saudi oil. A deal that, according to the book, even played a role in indirectly financing Osama bin Laden years down the line.
From the outside looking in, his life was picture perfect. He's staying in first-class hotels, eating at the best restaurants. He even had a yacht docked in Boston Harbor right next to the historic USS Constitution. But beneath all that luxury, the economic models he was creating were silently devastating the local populations.
The very same kinds of people he cared so deeply about back in his Peace Corps days. The gap between the rich and the poor was exploding, and it was fueled directly by his blueprints.
Section 3. A crisis of conscience.
Eventually, the sheer weight of all this geopolitical maneuvering had to catch up with him. We've got to ask, how does someone who spent years justifying these crippling loans finally face their own guilt? For Perkins, the cognitive dissonance between the extreme luxury of his lifestyle and the crushing poverty he was engineering simply became too loud to ignore.
Things really hit a breaking point in 1978. Perkins is sitting in this plush hotel bar in Tehran, Iran, when an old college friend of his named Farhad taps him on the shoulder. Farhad basically tells him something very dangerous is brewing and urges him to flee the country immediately. And sure enough, shortly after, the US-backed Shah of Iran is overthrown. For Perkins, witnessing the chaotic, real-time collapse of an Islam-backed regime totally shattered the illusion that his work was somehow bringing stability to the world.
When he gets back to Boston, the guilt just washes over him. He tells this really poignant story about wandering past his staff's desks outside his office. It hits him like a ton of bricks. He was blindly training a brand new generation to advance this empire. But here's the catch. Unlike him, they hadn't been initiated by Claudine. They were just innocently following his economic formulas, completely in the dark about the destructive global web they were weaving. He realized he had become the deceiver.
Section 4. Blowing the whistle.
That massive wake-up call leads us to his exit from the shadows. In 1980, Perkins officially quits his job at Maine. But it wasn't exactly a clean break. Throughout the 80s and 90s, he ran an alternative energy company, but he openly admits he took highly paid consulting gigs that were basically legal bribes designed to keep him from writing a tell-all book. It wasn't until the tragedy of September 11, 2001, that he felt this overwhelming moral imperative that finally outweighed his fear. That's what pushed him to expose the system, officially publishing the book in 2004.
When the biography dropped, it became a massive international bestseller almost overnight. But Perkins makes a point to clarify something really vital. He didn't write this to pitch some grand, secret conspiracy theory run by a cartoonish cabal of villains in a smoky room. No, this was a confession of how he, alongside countless everyday professionals, willfully and often unconsciously, collaborated to build a degenerative system, simply because it was fueled by widely accepted economic dogma.
Looking back at his life's work, Perkins draws this incredibly stark line between two models. On one side, you have the death economy he helped construct, a system that devours natural resources, obsessively chases short-term profits, and runs entirely on debt and fear. But on the other side is what he spends his life advocating for now, a life economy, one that is regenerative, sustainable, cooperative, and actually focused on genuine long-term human prosperity. As Perkins wraps up his story, he recalls a piece of advice from his mentor, Howard Zinn, who reminded him that this global corporatocracy only survives through our own inertia. It relies on our collective permission. If we look the other way, we're supporting it. So, after walking through John Perkins' incredible journey from an architect of empire to a whistleblower, we have to leave you with this. How might you be unconsciously participating in the systems Perkins describes? And more importantly, what will you do to change it?